This week we catch back up with Pink Floyd, who are on the precipice of Dark Side of the Moon. But first we travel back to 1971 for Meddle. Hello and welcome back to A Sort of Young Person's Guide to Prog Rock. I am your host, Ian Prize. So when last we left the Floyd, we had just witnessed the departure of their frontman Syd Barrett, shortly after their 1968 psychedelic album Saucerful of Secrets. They then went on to record a movie soundtrack, More. Somewhere within that, they recorded the double album of completely unlistenable solo pieces with Ummagumma. But the 60s were over and it was time to get down to work. So with Meddle, Pink Floyd would shed the last of their truly psychedelic noodling. The album would be jammed, written, and recorded in various studios during their 1970 tour. And with Meddle, they would maintain their taste for experimentation, but start to focus on clearly played and crisply recorded melodies. But their big achievement on this album would be the second half, a 20-minute epic, Echoes, which is still beloved by their fans to this day. So for me personally, after discovering Pink Floyd with Dark Side and Wish You Were Here, it was only natural to go back through their catalog, upon which I arrived at their live album/concert movie, Live at Pompeii. This included Echoes, and Echoes really does make good on the promise of an extended Pink Floyd song. So everything you've heard about this album is true. It is just wonderful. And here to wonder with me are Anne.
Yes, hello.
Hello, Anne. Brian.
Hello.
Hello, Brian. And Ryan.
Howdy doody.
Hello, Ryan. So, bubbling away behind me are the entrees being prepared in the kitchen. But right now I've got these appetizers. So we've got Fragile and Trilogy being plated up. But today, we've got Meddle. So we're going to start with you, Brian. Do you have any first thoughts about Meddle?
Well, I think universally this is considered the first step towards the Pink Floyd we know and love in their classic era. That being said, if you really pick apart what's on this album, I think it's like a halfway step. At times it feels, I don't want to say directionless, but it's still a band experimenting with their sound. There's an interesting sandwich of One of These Days and Echoes that has, I think, that are tonally very similar. And then an interesting mix of holiday love comedy songs in the middle.
Yeah.
That's the meat of the sandwich.
The meat of sandwich.
So it is kind of a strange composition. Overall, I think it really works. And they're coming off of Atom Heart Mother, which I think, this might sound strange, I think tonally it's kind of similar because it's a bit all over the place. You have, Atom Heart Mother, which was, I think, maybe an attempt to be an Echoes-like song. I think it's far less successful. But I think Echoes is truly the beginning of Floyd we know. I think it's such a huge step up in their sound, and it's confidently in that next era. But I don't think you can really ignore some of the other strange songs that are on this album.
Yeah, I was going to say, I guess that echoes my main thesis, just that this album is indeed a series of experiments. And it's not like as heavy as the later stuff, Dark Side and whatnot, and we'll get into what I mean by that later. I've always thought we're waiting for Roger Waters' lyrics, a little bit of sonic clarity, and then really highlighting David Gilmour's guitar. We don't really have David's legendary solos yet. We just have a lot of very nice David Gilmour guitar. But for this album, they have the makings of the kind of cinematicness and the dynamics and the atmosphere, which we'll get into. But I feel like those elements are here and have always been part of Floyd's kind of genius and sound.
I just think it's really interesting, though, to think of where they started with that and how drastically different these two things are as they start to leave behind the world of Syd Barrett's psychedelia. And they went with this unbelievably overly ambitious, oft-loved and hated album And I think this starts to see them focused in a way that they never had been before, which is interesting because the lore around it says there was no central theme, although I guess I'll unpack this a little bit more later. I think there's a very obvious one, but we'll get there.
Ooh, okay, well, we'll put a pin in that one. That's interesting. A central theme to this, okay. So, Anne, where did you come to on this album?
Funny you should ask. I have a slight tangent just about Pink Floyd in general. My first real exposure to them was through a college course about rhetorical criticism, which is the analysis of like symbols and words and phrases and images and stuff in art, basically, right? So kind of putting on different lenses with which to view pieces of work. And for one of my major projects, I had to analyze Pink Floyd's The Wall in depth.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So I listened to it multiple times. I watched the movie, and I ultimately chose looking at The Wall through the ideological criticism of the feminist lens.
Okay.
Which is pretty damning of that particular album. And I was convinced I never wanted to listen to Pink Floyd again after this school project was over. And I should mention, The Wall came out in 1979, right? So Meddle came out in 1971, 8 years earlier. Yeah. All I knew was everyone had told me that The Wall was not a good representation of Pink Floyd's body of work. So I walked into this only knowing that it wasn't going to be like The Wall. And I was very pleasantly surprised, probably because I had such not a low bar, but a certain bar, right? A bar placed because of the music on The Wall and the content of The Wall. So it wasn't very difficult for me to enjoy this album by comparison. And it is very, very different from their later stuff, which I kind of regret that I hadn't heard some of their earlier albums, so I don't have some comparison of the journey that they've made as a band. But that's my little tale about Anne and Pink Floyd. Overall, I enjoyed this album. I found it not quite easy listening, per se, but definitely easier than some of the other prog rock I've listened to. It was, I guess, a little more relaxing and slower tempo than I was expecting. I experienced a little trepidation seeing the 23-minute timestamp on Echoes. I ultimately enjoyed that song more than I thought I would.
It goes down real smooth, and I think we will talk about this in depth, but I think that's Pink Floyd's ultimate gift, is that they make everything go down smooth.
Mostly.
Mostly. We'll talk about the rough edges in a bit. But I guess I'll come to you real quick, Ryan. You are very, very aware of Pink Floyd's psychedelic wilderness. What do you think they took from it, and what do you think they jettisoned hard for Meddle?
Well, I mean, when I think of like Piper at the Gates of Dawn type of psychedelia, I think I actually, this is my opinion, it's very discordant to me. It's very jangly. It's very aggressive as far as what I find to be very jarring sounds. And it has to be David Gilmour's influence, but the way he delivers his lyrics, it's very, very similar from track to track. They get rid of the flavor of Syd Barrett hard. It's like he wasn't in the band.
Yep.
It is such an about face that it's like he was never there at all.
Yep.
I don't know if this is going to make sense, and tell me, Ian, if I've got this totally wrong, but in the theme of that transition album, it almost feels like they have a few of these songs that maybe work in the earlier era. I'm kind of specifically talking Fearless, Saint-Tropez, Seamus, and it's almost like, let's just get these out of the way as we transition to the new sound. The same year they released Relics, which is like their rarities and B-side album. A lot of bands have done that, right? And honestly, some of these songs feel like the B-sides, just like some weird little songs they're just trying to get out. They didn't make the cut on earlier albums. I think the Who have Odds and Sods, so I know there's a few different bands that have done things like this.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what it feels like to me.
I'd say that might be a function of how they kind of put this together, because I get the sense that they really did go into the studio and jam this out. I think the next big element that's coming is that Roger Waters is going to start leading the band. I think this is the full Democracy Zone. So you're right. I think it probably does sound kind of odds and sodsy. Yeah, these feel, the middle songs certainly feel like songs from an earlier era.
Well, obviously, after Meddle, the band confidently stepped into their new sound that redefined the era, Obscured by Clouds. The album we all know and love, the one we all had the album cover on, on T-shirts. Everyone knows that one.
Oh.
And sorry, there's one last funny thing I wanted to say about Obscured by Clouds, and I hope to God we never actually cover it, because who cares? Obscured by Clouds was done for a French film called La Vallée. The band had a fallout with the filmmakers, and they, instead of like music from La Vallée, they changed it to Obscured by Clouds. To maintain the Pink Floyd collection, the movie was originally just then released as Obscured by Clouds to follow what Pink Floyd did. I just thought that was funny. And now I think it's released as La Vallée.
Have you ever subjected yourself to any of those movies?
No. I certainly wouldn't do it now, but even in the days of just absolutely listening to every Pink Floyd song all the time, it never once crossed my mind to watch any of these movies. I just had no desire whatsoever, because I think they're all like Loss of Innocence, Spirit of 76, Spirit of 67, and as we know, I hate hippies, so... The final general question I'll ask. What do we feel about the sound of this? I'm thinking of a few things here. The first is David's guitar tone, and then David, Rick, and I don't really think Roger sings that much on this, but the blend of vocals. What are we feeling about that?
The vocals were pretty, for me, unremarkable, but they're not, in my mind, supposed to be the focus, necessarily. I'm not supposed to be listening to this thinking, holy crap, this guy can sing.
Yep.
So much as I'm supposed to be appreciating the entire work of art and how the lyrics fit in to the overall emotion and sense of feeling and what's trying to be expressed through the song. So, end of thought.
And we'll talk about why Pink Floyd, like why they are the prog band that made it. And one of my main feelings about it is, unlike the other prog bands, they had generic British guy vocals. They're not particularly epic. They're not John Anderson off in space. They're not King Crimson changing every 5 seconds. They're not Peter Gabriel, like, packed with character. They're just some guy singing, and I feel like that's served generations hence of 14-year-olds in their garage who can just kind of play a Pink Floyd song, and you're not reaching for, like, oh, I can't be Freddie Mercury. It's like, yeah, I can be, for a garage band, a rough approximation of Dave Gilmour or Roger Waters.
Yeah, they're the opposite of distracting.
And I was going to say, I'd say for the most part, I feel like that's how I would describe Pink Floyd. Kind of after they leave the psychedelic wilderness of their previous handful of albums, there's no longer a drum fill that you particularly notice. There's no longer like a run of organ jams that you're like, oh my God. It's just like very smooth guitar solos, very beautifully constructed songs. And that doesn't take anything away from it. I think it's just that to me explains why sonically they are for everyone.
Yeah, I know if this makes it into the podcast, someone's going to hate me for saying this and making this comparison. However, I feel like the modern day equivalent would be something like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, which if you count how many radio stations play the Red Hot, they're just so, I guess, inoffensive. Like the vocals are just so, I don't hate to use the word unremarkable again, but they're just kind of there and they add to the song and you're listening to the words, but it's definitely more of a vibe than, yeah, as you mentioned, Freddie Mercury. And now we have artists like Adele and Ariana Grande and Louis Capaldi, where their vocal tone is everything about their performance. Sam Smith is another great example. If there was a less recognizable, less, you could argue, controversial tone singing those songs, they wouldn't be as successful as they are.
I guess I didn't even mean to say that he's anonymous. I think Pink Floyd very much has a sound, and we'll probably get into the embryo of this sound on this album.
Well, this, you're asking like what they kept and what they got rid of earlier.
Yep.
The vocals specifically, that big, smooth vanilla milkshake of multi-tracked David Gilmour, that goes straight into Dark Side.
Yep.
If there's anything where there's like a seamless transition, it's all over the place. And they kept that for, well, quite some time.
Yep. So we start with One of These Days, which is, I don't even know how to describe it, basically a bass crescendo to Nick Mason's slowed down vocals in which he says, "One of these days, I'm going to cut you into little pieces." Any thoughts about One of These Days?
I don't know how accurate this is, but I did hear that it was aimed at a particular radio DJ that they all hated.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah. There doesn't seem to be a good reason for them hating him other than he babbled a lot, which I guess is you being bad at your job as a DJ. If you're babbling and people don't enjoy your babble.
Yeah.
My favorite description of this line is what I was reading about is threatening lyrics, and I was like, yes.
Very threatening.
It's very threatening. Sir Jimmy Young, the then BBC Radio 1 and 2 DJ. Apparently, during Pink Floyd's early 1970s concerts, they would play a sound collage of clips from Young's radio show that was edited to sound completely nonsensical, thus figuratively cutting him into little pieces.
Okay. Okay.
So, I mean, that's a very non-violent way to interpret these lyrics.
No, and when I was going to say, I think because like Pink Floyd didn't seem to have that much of an aggressive streak. They're a pretty mellow band. It seemed like a very interesting, if you're picking one line, you've got a big giant bass intro, things are rocking, and you have one line, and you go with that one. Like, it's one of those, I've never questioned it because it works in the song. Like, you're just like, oh yeah, that's exactly what I would say at that moment in time.
I did a cursory search about this guy. There didn't seem to be anything terribly obvious. I mean, he's passed away now, but is Sir Jimmy Young like a beloved UK broadcaster? Is he like...
I gotta be honest, nope. I've never heard the... Yeah. But that's just how good of a job they did on him. Is
Wow, they erased him.
Yeah.
Wild.
I think what this song did for me is highlights how amazing Pink Floyd are at crafting albums. And I think every single Pink Floyd album, they are so good, and you can forget how good they are because it almost feels like a trope, but they have like the beginning-y song, and then they have the ending-y song, which we'll come to with Echoes. But again, like, these are the most epic songs ever to begin and end an album with, and I think they just do such a good job at that to say, like, we're signposting that we're doing a beginning thing.
You know, I can see this song. I can see it as a light show. It seems like it's meant to be played live with, the classic Pink Floyd laser effects going. Yeah. It's very fun. It's very ooky spooky.
I don't mean to just be so agreeable, but it's almost like, yeah, you can imagine a film opening up with this. It has a very opening credits type feel as they set the scene. You get introduced to a couple of the characters, maybe.
Is also kind of why I think the transition to the middle part of the album is a little strange, but I think it fits tonally very, very well with Echoes. I think it's maybe one of the best Roger Waters instrumentals. I mean, obviously we think of, the virtuoso as David Gilmour, but I think Rogers is rocking pretty hard here.
I am going to blow your mind. And guess who is playing one of two basses?
Oh my God.
It's David Gilmour.
Wait, really?
Yes. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So Roger is playing the dun 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 bit, and then David Gilmour is playing the like the crazy bass bit, and then he overdubbed some slide guitar over it. But yes, that is David Gilmour playing the bass. But yeah, no, whoever was playing the bass, they did an amazing job. And such a unique song, because it really is just a bass crescendo.
Wild.
To your point about this being you can see the visuals here. Obviously Pink Floyd, very visual band. I don't know exactly where they are on that journey with this, but they were always, with the light shows and the, crazy lava lamp effects. And I think they're moving towards lasers and smoke, and then they're moving onwards to the blow up pigs and stuff later. But yeah, they've always had that cinematic element to that. It like literally cinematic, where they have a visual element to this. But also in terms of carefully constructed concerts, it will be fun for you to know this and Echoes were the only two that really made it onto their live rotation. And you're saying that these feel like the future of Floyd and the rest of the songs felt like the past. This opened their concerts during the Dark Side of the Moon tour.
Oh.
Because I was like, what did they play on the Dark Side of the Moon tour? Because like Wish You Were Here and Another Brick in the Wall and, none of those had been written yet. So it was this, a handful of other basically live at Pompeii style songs, and then Echoes, and then they played Dark Side of the Moon.
Wow.
And then I think also, once they became famous, they never toured with other bands ever because they wanted to make a show. So they'd start at 0 and finish at 60. Every night they would just do their thing.
I did not know that. That's a fun little piece of trivia.
No, and I thought about it. I was like, oh, yeah, I've never heard of a band like opening for Pink Floyd. And I was like, oh, yeah, when I thought about it, I was like, oh, yeah, that's true. So next we come on to Pillow of Winds. So the name of this song apparently came from a mahjong formation. Basically, it's just a folk song with a bunch of pastoral imagery. I guess the very first thing I thought of when this song came on is its mellowness really pointed to the fact that Pink Floyd is outside of prog rock for me. They really do let the songs breathe, and the concepts breathe, actually. I've never really had that aggressive feeling that you get from Yes or ELP, where like, we're going to do it better than we did it last year, like we're going to go harder and harder and harder. And this is, of course, just a great example of that. Like, it's just Dave Gilmour just being mellow.
This is the beginning of the vacation. Other than the obvious lyrical themes where he's just talking about being on some faraway island with his romantic partner of some kind, it conjures up, images of spending some time in like the Dutch Caribbean, like somewhere in Bonaire in the 70s where there would have been nothing there. And it really would have felt like a little bit of a retreat from, it's not now, but the sound texture, the really, really heavy-handed lyrics, it's like you said earlier, it goes down really smooth. And this, I don't know, you don't have to read between the lines very closely.
And what are they taking a vacation from?
What are they taking a vacation from?
Yeah.
I mean, the really crazy parts of their touring hadn't really happened yet, but I can imagine putting on that kind of show they would have at that point is still something that is, I think of like how sensorially absolutely overwhelming being at one of those shows was. I can't imagine actually performing the shows any easier.
And I do think they were, at this point, they were already on global tours, so they really are touring. This is a very interesting theory that this album is about being on vacation. I love that theory. That's a great theory.
It's an interesting theory. I don't know if I fully agree. I mean, I hear Pillow of Winds is more of a love song than anything. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think this very much stands out in their discography. I can't think of any other Pink Floyd love songs. Now, I'm sure on Imaguma or something weird like that, there's probably something, but I hear two lovers like in a bed cuddling.
Yeah, a lazy Sunday wake up.
Yes.
I will say, to defend the vacation theory, again, not so much that it is a rock opera, but like that these are all vacation-y songs. Again, with the exception of the Rat Race of One of These Days, I do feel like these are all very vacation-y songs. They're just so chill, so Jack Johnson-y. And again, to what you said there, Brian, is two lovers lazing in a bed on a Sunday, just enjoying the tropical breezes, I guess.
The other thing that scares me about the middle part of this album is there's only one bad song, but I find them fine, if not enjoyable, but largely forgettable. Yeah,
I would say fine but forgettable. I think that's a fair reading.
I liked the chord progression on this song. If I was a better musician, I wouldn't have had to look up what it was I liked about it. However, I'm a mediocre musician, so I had to look it up. And I think it's the ninth. I think they add the ninth to both. The song starts in E major, middle section is in E minor, and in both of those, they very prominently feature the ninth. So the ninth of the scale, and it just adds this little fun color to the song that would otherwise wouldn't have had. I'm pretty sure that's what I was hearing that made it just more interesting.
And I was going to say, I actually think this brings up the other element I think that really contributes to Pink Floyd's kind of cultural longevity, is Dave Gilmour and his guitar parts are so fun to play for normal people that you can, again, get those kids in the garage, and for decades since, they have been playing these songs, whereas no kids, at 14 are going to play Yes. Like, it's not happening. I'm sure, Ryan, you remember us all getting together and trying to learn Fearless or whatever. Dave creates these parts that are fun to play and sound good when you play them. And I'll say an intermediate level. Like, you don't need to be ridiculous. So next we come to Fearless, which is probably the most normal song on this album. Yeah, I'd say it's the most songish song. It's got a riff. It's got nice lyrics about facing your fears, I guess. And then it ends with a soccer chant, which we'll talk about in a bit. Anyways, any thoughts about Fearless?
It's interesting where at one point I'm almost hearing it's like someone saying they're fearless about getting into a fight. Like I'll pick the time and the place. But then there's also elements of like I'm going to be on the hill. I think maybe it's about saying it's to go your own way, to be your own person. You have to be fearless. Yeah. That's kind of what I hear.
I think, maybe it's all different aspects of fearlessness. I mean, there's that whole bit in the middle about, the fool who faces the crowd. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if this kind of concept was explored again on Brain Damage from Darkside, where it was the fool who dares to tread on the grass.
Yes. That's actually a very interesting comparison.
I get the sense from Roger Waters this was the point where he really felt like, okay, I need to start making a go of it. He says in the Dark Side of the Moon documentary he needed to take the reins. I wonder if he's starting to explore that concept in his mind and his heart.
Interesting.
Well, it's so unbelievably positive, so it makes me wonder what he was going through at the time. But then you could also look at it as a little bit of gloating in an I told you so.
Yeah, I think it's only positive when he's talking about himself, right? Because every time he says you, he's like, you say the hill is too steep to climb. You say you'd like to see me try. All the positive is him saying, I will climb that hill in my own way. I look down, hearing the sound of the things you've said today. So it's positive about his own ability to overcome, but not necessarily the world around him, was my interpretation of these lyrics.
Well, yeah, and the whole merciless the magistrate turns around. It's like, authority sucks and I don't like it. Boo.
Which is a theme he will explore quite a few times later. No, I was going to say, actually, it's the other interesting thing. So this is yet another brick in the wall of Pink Floyd's popularity. Is I actually feel they have lyrics that make sense in a way that ELPs and Yeses and King Crimsons never did.
They're not an abstract word picture.
No, exactly. And these are complete sentences. They have concrete ideas within them. And obviously I think like the apotheosis of this will be later for Dark Side and Wish You Were Here. They now feel almost too cliche or too simple or whatever. Like they feel obvious in a way that John Anderson's lyrics never will.
Well.
And actually, genuinely, I don't know how much of the world doesn't speak English. I'm assuming like a good 5.5 billion don't even speak English as a second language. And Pink Floyd will be popular amongst a lot of them because I think they're singable. Like, these are very singable lyrics, and they translate pretty well. And they're about, like, real things.
It's funny that you mentioned the part about being understandable or and what the language barrier that may or may not exist in different parts of the world. That's kind of the opposite approach that a band like Rammstein takes now. We're like, we have to put on this theatrical performance because 80% of the audience has no idea what the
we're
words
saying.
are.
Yep. And I was going to say, like, they're sung clearly as well.
Yeah.
And actually, I was going to say, I think we already have Rick Wright backing David now. And I will say, in so much as David Gilmour is just, for me, just the standard, like, British male voice, I feel like Rick Wright's the standard British male backing voice, and they just go so well together. Again, in that smooth vanilla milkshake sort of way, they just sound great together, and they're close enough that they don't jar. and they're different enough that it sounds like a second voice. You know, I believe Anne made the point that kind of just part of the song. Like, they don't stand out above and beyond it. They're just part of the song, being there, sounding good.
Maybe this is a little controversial, but at least from this point forward, the sound of their two voices working together almost kind of defines Pink Floyd for me. Because even after Waters leaves the band, they go on to do their own thing. And while I don't say I love the post-Waters albums, there's some good tunes, but they very much still sound like themselves. Like, oh, this is clearly Pink Floyd.
I guess going back to one of the first questions around whether Echoes overshadows the rest of the numbers on this album. I don't know how accurate this is, but it was this song was supposedly considered for the best of album of Pink Floyd. It was ultimately rejected, so I don't know how you would verify that it was considered and not chosen. But I could see that, I guess. I believe it. Reading it, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense.
For a best of, I feel like this is the perfect song from this album. I mean, I feel like obviously Echoes is the defining song of this album, but if I had to be like, yeah, we're going to get like 4 minutes off of every album, it's got to be Fearless.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, and I don't mean this in an insulting way at all, because I adore this song. I really do. It still reminds me of, you know, being on vacation as a kid, and you turn on the TV in the hotel, and there's always the information channel that's playing. Which is, I mean, that's a dated reference, because God knows we don't use those anymore. But the scrolling messages or the TV guide, you can hear this guitar riff, and you're like, yeah, that fits.
Yeah,
seems like something I heard when I was 9 years old.
Like Smooth Lounge.
Yeah.
The other very interesting sonic element he added at the end, and I believe this is Roger Waters who added it, is the soccer chant at the end. You'll Never Walk Alone, which was a Rodgers and Hammerstein that was adapted by Jerry and the Pacemakers in 1963. They were a band in the Merseyside beat scene. Interestingly, they were produced by George Martin, producer of the Beatles, so they came from that scene. It became a local hit in Liverpool, and then Liverpool FC, the soccer team for the American listeners, took the chant on as a soccer chant. So this is You'll Never Walk Alone, as sung by Liverpool FC, that they slapped on the end of Fearless. As a little American child, I'd just been like, oh yeah, there's some random chanting at the end of this song. I'd never give it a second thought. But actually, I was like, thematically, I actually really like that juxtaposition. And you know, I was saying about brain damage. So one of the most interesting parts about brain damage is say you're a fool, you're walking on the grass, society will judge you, blah, 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 blah. But if the band you're in starts playing different tunes, I'll see you on the dark side of the moon, suggesting that you'll never walk alone. I will be there by your side. And so again, in so much as Pink Floyd can be friendly and warm and supportive, you know, maybe that's what's going on here.
But I think a very, very interesting point there, Ian. I think you've convinced me that this is that start of that theme.
Yeah, I think it goes nicely with the last chorus lyrics, which is, go down in your own way, and every day is the right day. You look down, hearing the sound of the faces in the crowd. And then the chant is, walk on with hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone. You'll never walk alone. Liverpool, Liverpool, Liverpool.
And as far as I'm aware, Roger and none of the band members actually have a connection to Liverpool. They must just like the song. Like, it is, like, I listened to it as sung by Liverpool fans. Like, you know, they still do it today. It is pretty good. I mean, it's a great song.
Oh, I think, you know, frankly, and I'm sorry for absolutely every other football club in merry old England, I cannot think of a better one. Like, it's such a good song, and it's so powerful. And the Jerry and the Pacemakers version is very good, so this is a shout out for them too. It is a super emotional and powerful song, so they've got the market covered there.
Well, I think, you know, it hurts me to say this, but sometimes you just have to admit when, regardless of your loyalties, when someone has better music, like, I think the British patriotic songs are far better than the American ones. I think that, like, Jerusalem,
yeah,
you know, God Save the King, Britain Rules the Waves, whatever that name of that song is, they're all bangers.
Yeah. I think the only one we have is God Bless the USA. That's the only song we have.
I like Battle Hymn of the
Republic.
No.
I do too. It's the hymns, man. It's the hymns. So then we go on quite literally a vacation to Saint-Tropez. So this is a fun Côte d'Azur, south of France, jazzy jaunt that is a Roger Waters solo composition. It's got a fun little Rick Wright keyboard, which I just love hearing. Here we are, Saint-Tropez.
Obviously, this is a vacation song or a holiday song.
Yeah.
No debate for me here. This might be my favorite of the meat sandwich.
Okay.
Fun, it's cheery.
Oh, I was just going to say, that's where my whole, the album's about being on vacation. It's like, oh, haha, Ryan, you're not very clever. That was actually about them going on a trip.
They are quite literally going on vacation. This is a straight up Roger joint. It is just his song about being on vacation.
I will say I loved the wordplay of these lyrics. I liked the rhyme scheme of all the half rhymes that he manages to fit into these lyrics. Yeah. I found that those are fun to listen to.
Yeah, I really feel like this one, even though, again, I don't really see where he takes his lyrics and how he gets from here to Dark Side of the Moon or whatever, you can hear that Roger's starting to have some fun.
Yeah, like in the first verse, it's breaking a stick with a brick on the sand, riding a wave in the wake of an old sedan. It feels like a childhood rhyme almost, right? Of something that you'd read as a kid. And
I was going to say, I think the fun jauntiness of it just dovetails so beautifully with his little vacation theme.
It's funny that you mentioned it's like a childhood rhyme, because then he's talking about being on an expensive boat, and I think about like, oh no, I've got to restain the teak.
Yeah, this is just a song that always comes to me when I'm on vacation. It sounds good. I love Rick's piano. Like, I actually really like that Rick got to bust out a piano here. I feel like it sits well outside of everything else Pink Floyd ever did. Even though I don't even really listen to the song all that much, and I don't love this song deeply, but it's just like, yeah, look at me, I'm on the Riviera.
It's weird because I can imagine, close my eyes, and see David sitting on the porch playing this song, but I can't imagine Roger for some reason.
Well, no, actually, it's interesting you say that, because this is like the sweetest his voice will ever be. Because his voice is about to get real gnarly, certainly as we come up to Animals in the Wall. But he's about to get a deep edge to his voice. This, he is putting on a soft, jazzy tone. So we come then to the most famous song on this album, Seamus. I don't even feel like dunking on it that much. So the story behind Seamus is they heard at some house party a dog that liked to howl at music. They thought this was hilarious, so they recorded a 12-bar blues complete throwaway song with a dog howling in the background. Ryan, on your vacation theme, this is just hanging on a porch with your pup, playing some 12-bar blues. It is a pretty laid-back song.
There's a quote by David Gilmour about this saying, "I guess it wasn't really as funny to everyone else as it was to us." And I just, I think that's a good way to describe it, as something that maybe in the studio it seems like a great idea and you think it's funny and awesome, and then it gets released to the world and you're like, oh, maybe it was more of an inside joke than we thought it was.
Had to be there.
Yeah.
You saying that, though, makes me like it more.
Yeah.
Because I love a good in-joke.
Ian, we are at the cat food of Pink Floyd.
Yeah,
this feels like an inside joke, as you said, that we're not invited to. I'm sure, especially bands like Pink Floyd, as they would cover in "Wish You Were Here," see all the dangers of the music industry and people interfering with their music. But this might be one case where their producers should have been like, "I don't know about this one, guys." It's like when George Lucas had full reign over the prequels, no one was checking his power, and maybe someone just should have told him not to do this. But yeah, I don't hate, my scale, cat food is always at the bottom. This is not a hatred song.
Yeah.
But it is forgettable and weird and strange. It's on this album. Surely they could have had another song than this, but I guess that's what works.
I don't know. It's one of those songs that it just like, I've skipped it every time since. I like the confidence of a band to literally try anything. And this is about as literally try anything as it gets.
I would just classify this as a classic throwaway song.
Yep. I don't think anyone ever, like, after, like, I have to know if this famous band Pink Floyd really did this thing, and then after that, you know, like,
I would love to know what came first, the howling, and someone said, this should be on a song, or the song, and someone said, this should have howling. What order did that happen in? I want to know.
So the thing that really shoots them in the foot in that regard is the dog doesn't howl a tune. It's actually pretty off-key for most of the song. Was the dog actually named Seamus?
Oh, I'm sorry. The song is named after a border collie. I don't know if the border collie is the one. Oh, I'm sorry. It was a Russian wolfhound named Knobs that provides the howling accompaniment.
So I think that was the live version.
Yeah, they played that in Live in Pompeii.
They played it again at Live in Pompeii because it was great the first time around. Oh. Okay, so I'm going to assume everyone listening to me now has at some point heard Seamus. If you have not, you have to go listen to it. I think in my mind, I just remembered them recording a dog howling for 3 minutes straight. I actually think the more egregious part about the song is that it's just some 12-bar blues. Like, as you said, it's not even that it was like an insane experiment. It was just them playing a song and a dog howling. And I think that was more egregious. That I feel like they could have honestly played 3 more minutes of echoes or just repeated one of these days, and it would have been an infinitely better album.
I believe Ryan said this in a previous episode, but it kind of feels like, how does it go? The only person not annoyed by a jackhammer is the one using it. Like,
yeah.
That's kind of what
that's
this
the feeling.
like.
Yeah. I'll end Seamus with one very, very, very minor defense of Pink Floyd. I will say this is very much in line with Pink Floyd's use of non-musical noise. So I'm glad in some small way they were experimenting. It's just that, as we all know, some experiments do not work. So that was Seamus. So we flip over the album to the one and the only Echoes. So Echoes is the 20-minute masterpiece on the other side of this album. So I'm going to start us off by just saying that first ping. The first ping was Richard Wright, the keyboardist, playing a very, very high note through a Leslie rotating speaker, which gives it that little woozy sound. And it's funny how Pavlovian a response that one single note is, where I feel like if I even hear a note that's like that, even out in the world, where, you know, someone's microwave is beeping or something, I'm salivating and I'm like, oh my God, I'm strapped in for 20 minutes now. And it's like, this is genuinely the genius of Pink Floyd.
So you're Cartman every time he hears Come Sail Away.
Yeah.
I was just thinking that. I was just thinking of that.
This is the genius of Pink Floyd, is they created an audio tag, which absolutely just acts as like this calling card that's like, okay, I'm getting mentally prepared. I'm getting ready. Here we go. Like, it's time for Echoes. You know, they do this again with the strings in Shine On You Crazy Diamond, where they just start with that like low string hum. And again, It's not anything. It's like some D minor just played on like some synthesized Mellotron-y sound. And again, like I'm salivating. I'm like, I'm ready for this song now. And I actually couldn't think of many other songs. I'm sure there are plenty, but many other songs where they have such a simple thing that gets you absolutely jammed to hear the song.
Well, the closest thing I can think of is Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Those 4 notes are the most recognizable notes in I think the whole world, that sequence.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like all of Western music right there.
Yeah, and just hearing those 4 notes in that order, you're like geared up for some hardcore orchestral madness.
Yep. And it's funny that they shaved a riff down to 1 note.
Well, speaking of riffs, I know what we're going to cover in a little bit.
Take us there, Ryan.
Well, we all know how much Roger Waters loved musicals and was particularly a fan of musical theater. And Andrew Lloyd Webber, best buds. What can I say?
The end. End of story. No, so take us there, Ryan.
Well, we were listening to it in the car today, and that guitar riff plays, and Anne's face immediately changes.
Yep.
Like, wait a second, where have I heard this before?
So yeah, that's what ultimately I think I decided is it's hard to try to claim ownership of a riff that is the chromatic scale.
Yeah.
However, I do think there's some grounds on the rhythm because the rhythm is identical.
Yeah.
The notes, I don't think you can trademark, but the rhythm and the notes in conjunction, who knows? It is pretty much the same riff from the Phantom of the Opera that da 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 da.
And it's funny because in this, it's just such perfect epic rock. And in that, it's such perfect epic organ solo-ness.
I think I would respect it more if Andrew Lloyd Webber came out and said, yes, I did take inspiration from Pink Floyd for this rock opera.
Yeah. To his credit, like, besides that sweet, sweet riff, it's a completely different song. But, you know, as in, like, in every single capacity, it's such a different song. But you're right. I feel like if he just said, yeah, I remember in 1971, I love that one riff. Thanks, Raj. Like,
he doesn't even let this go, though. He has a lyric in 1992, which is 21 years after this. He has to dunk on Andrew Lloyd Webber again.
What's the lyric?
Lloyd Webber's awful stuff runs for years and years and years. An earthquake hits the theater, but the operetta lingers. Then the piano lid comes down and breaks his fucking fingers. It's a miracle.
Roger.
Yeah.
No, my only other thing, which I'm absolutely going to cut out. Do you remember Phantom of the Brian, Ryan?
Oh my god. So
what?
We had a dorm room in college when we were freshmen, and one of the walls was all glass. It was all windows. So it got very hot if you left the blinds open during any time other than the dead of winter. It got toasty. So Brian decided to cool off one of these days, and Ian and I were coming back from class or lunch or who knows what, but I think we heard music from outside the door, and I think
organ music.
Yes. Like
organ
raucous organ music, which we find out is Rick Wakeman's Six Rise of Henry VIII. Yeah. That's a yes deep cut right there. So this is blaring, and Ian and I are like, all right, haha, Brian's listening to music. And we open the door, and it's very dark. The blinds are drawn. Like, it is almost pitch black in there, and all we see is the glow of his laptop, like Brian shirtless, like curled up in the corner like this, in the most like
a little Gremlinish
way.
Yeah,
like he was the hunchbackiest way he could have possibly been sitting, with just the glow of the computer lighting his sallow skin.
And then he disappeared into the rafters and just left one red rose in his seat.
And we never saw him again.
Whew. Okay, here we go. Fabulous. So the interesting thing about this album that you were talking about, the other songs on this album really lack dynamics. Or I guess they have dynamics, as in they have mellow and more mellow. I think this, Echoes, just has incredible dynamics. Like, it has a beginning, middle, and end. It's got crescendos, it's got funk, it's got everything in it.
To me, it's such a massive leap in their sound and their maturity. I believe, just like One of These Days, all four of them are credited as writers.
Yeah.
Which I think is, like many bands, the key to the peak of their success in their golden age. And as we talked about in Wish You Were Here, that was kind of the end of that period. And I wish there was more like this. I think to pull off a 23-minute song takes a tremendous amount of talent. Like, you almost have to earn the right to make a song that long, even a 10-minute song, let alone a 23-minute song. But God, it's good. I think this is their first truly great song.
Yeah.
In their discography.
And it all feels very cohesive, which, even though it has distinctive parts. And so I read about this, and it did begin as a collection of separate musical experiments, and then they kind of arranged it together. And it works. It works really well. I feel like each part kind of does maintain its individualism. and message. But then they flow really nicely into each other. Ryan, sorry, what were you going to say?
Oh, no, I was just going to agree with your point there. It very cleanly separates into these different movements, almost.
But it doesn't feel jarring.
No, like any other good, longer form piece, the movements, you're like, oh, now it's time to boogie down. We're going to, after the first vocal part.
I forget exactly how long the intro solo is, but it's like 3 or 4 minutes long. It's actually quite a sizable thing where you're just hanging with that little ping, a little bit of guitars, and like the Rick Wright just bubbling away on his little keyboards there. Oh, you're really left to build for like 3 or 4 minutes. So it's incredible that at least I never really get bored in this song.
I would agree with that. And hearing that Roger Waters wrote these lyrics as well and reading through them, it makes total sense. I wonder how many of these he also wrote in Saint-Tropez, because the references to the sea and the waves, everything is green and submarine.
I guess we're still on vacation.
Yeah. Well, like, this is me inserting my own personal narrative into the song, but like, one of these days when I capture like decent underwater footage, I'll do this. You could absolutely set the intro to scenes of people just, scuba diving along, exploring the briny depths where it is green and submarine.
The labyrinths of coral caves.
Yeah.
The briny depths of funk. So I would agree. Actually, in a more general sense, I think this is a super watery album. So we have Dave's guitar, which is a lot of slides and bends, kind of a lot of water imagery in the lyrics, and even that first like drip of echoes is kind of a watery bloop, bloop, bloop little drop. And of course, I think they realized it was a watery album when they asked Storm Thorgerson of Hypnosis to make this album cover, which is an ear underwater. And I feel like, honestly, I think they've had, quote unquote, some things to say about the album cover later, but I actually think it's a really fair representation. It's a watery album. It's a watery sound.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, this might be a stretch, but if this is tonally similar to any other prog rock song in the broader pantheon, is I Hear in the Wake of Poseidon, which is also a very watery, oceany song. So I would agree. I definitely agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's where like the instrumental part, when it starts to get really intense again, it's like, all right, the sea is swelling, the winds are moving in, the clouds are dark. We're gonna go batten down the hatches on shore for a while. I realize I am absolutely inserting my own story into this, which I'm sure they had no intention of doing. But then it's time to come back in when we boogie down because the tropical storm is coming.
You get seagulls. Now the funny thing is, I feel like I could handle the seagulls for about maybe 20 seconds or something, because I love the seagulls coming out into the bubbling guitar. So there's a guitar build right after the seagulls, and I feel like you actually can't have it without the seagulls. For everyone's benefit, I guess, to educate as well as edutain, the seagulls were born of David Gilmour plugging in his wah pedal backwards. So input to the output and output to the input. And he's like, wow, that sounds really annoying. Let's do that for 4 minutes. But the guitar build is just phenomenal. And then you get kind of washed back ashore onto the last part. And then that like swoosh and the little guitar licks on the end. I'm enamored. Top to bottom.
If you're from a safe vantage point, like a storm on the ocean is a gorgeous thing to watch. Again, provided you're somewhere on high dry ground. Yeah. But then as the guitar starts to bubble again, we get back into that epic couple notes he starts playing. That's like the clouds are opening back up, the sun starts streaming through, and
the phantom recedes back into the ocean.
Yeah, I'll put Ryan on the spot again. Ryan, you mentioned something about whales earlier.
That's what I always thought it was. I didn't think it was seagulls. I thought it was whale song, which maybe I say the story is way, way too recent, but that recent story about they finally found a buddy to that whale that...
They called him the loneliest whale in the world because he communicated at a different frequency than any other whales that we measured, and so he was known as the loneliest whale in the world because he couldn't talk to other whales, and he finally found a friend, communicates at the same frequency. He's no longer the loneliest whale in the world.
Oh, that's such a heartwarming story.
Isn't it?
It's funny, we've all put a story on top of this song, And that's the magic of it, is kind of like good incidental music or good programmatic music. We really said like, oh my God, that's me out on the sea. The clouds are opening. There's a storm brewing, whatever it is, like you're there. And it's funny, I don't even know what I think of when I think of this song. Like I don't know what the visual is for me. And even though we're not yet at David Gilmour doing his time solo or his money solo or whatever, the guitar work, it is darn near impossible to actually play as good as David Gilmour. Having tried 1,001 times, every time you play a note and you let it hang, you want to play 5 more notes. And like the pull, the deep, deep, deep atavistic pull to be like, okay, I'm going to start shredding is so strong. His restraint is phenomenal. You cannot play like David Gilmour. And I think he does these like whole note bend. So he'll bend like a full note up. He does a little bit of slide sometimes. He does his little wah, or his whammy bar rather. So you really get just single line notes, and they're just incredible.
Discretion is the better part of valor.
And then actually ditto for Rick Wright, where I feel like he's just adding some smooth keyboard in the back just to be texture. But again, he doesn't go off on like insane solos ever.
And it's never shrill.
Never shrill.
The way I find some of his playing in the earlier psychedelic, I find it shrill is the word.
Well, and actually, I was going to say that's one of those things that they jettisoned, and they jettisoned hard. So he had a Farfisa organ, I believe, back in the beginning. And on the very, very first albums, he really plays kind of like arabesque runs on this organ. And you really get kind of like a surf rocky type of jam from him. And he continues that really probably through Ummagumma or something like that. And then he calms himself down and just does some normal organs and some keys.
Yeah, get yourself a Hammond for God's sakes.
And now he's discovered the strings setting on his keyboard. And that, like, again, is just this really smooth, delicious style. And actually, I don't know how best to describe them, but they're very wet keys.
Yeah, it's like paint being blended together almost.
Yep. One final question in a deep sense, and then I'll ask my lead-out question. It feels like all of them are working together in a way that they will on Dark Side and then will never again. Do you get that feeling, like musically, that you feel like they're all working as a unified whole?
Yes, they kept it together longer than some of their contemporaries could. My theory about that is they managed to do what King Crimson couldn't do without switching the lineup. So you think about, the early kind of prog psychedelia in the Court, Wake Up Poseidon, but Robert Fripp has to literally change almost the rest of the band around him to grow into something different and evolve. And Pink Floyd doesn't have to do that, so they end up with a more cohesive body of work that's easier to digest, and they obviously had the commercial success that King Crimson never did.
And I think that's a good point. Like, they really do evolve. And I think that's the interesting thing about Pink Floyd is I think you really start at, like, psychedelic 60s and they evolve to the wall. And it's like an incredible straight shot journey almost. Like, you can really hear that each album they do another thing. One final point, actually, about that. So we had talked about Piper at the Gates of Dawn a handful of weeks ago. This was just an off-the-cuff thought. We dunk on the 70s bands for going 80s. Like, you're like, oh my God, like, Genesis, it's a completely different band in the 80s or whatever. Yes, it's a completely different band in the 80s. I can't believe how different Pink Floyd sound from Piper at the Gates of Dawn, like psychedelic swing in London 60s, to only 1971. Like, I can't believe the turnover with that. Because this is very much classic rock now. Like, this sounds like classic rock. And I was like, wow, that's only 4 years, and they went from, like, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds to this, basically.
A lot of music recorded in the late 1960s does not sound good on modern equipment anymore, modern playback equipment, whereas the 70s sounds amazing.
Yeah. And you can hear that, like, kind of really crispy, almost like Fleetwood Mac.
It's the FM radio sound.
Yeah, delectable. There we go. Just like the sea, we cruise off into the sunset. So yeah, I think Echoes is probably the longest lasting fan favorite because it has the best dynamics and it's got all these wonderful parts.
It's interesting. It obviously goes through, distinct parts. As far as I'm aware, unlike, say, Shine On You Crazy Diamond, this song isn't officially cut up into different pieces, is it?
No, not that I know of.
That's what I thought. Yeah. And while it certainly rises and then falls and then crescendos very well, it's not as bombastic as Close to the Edge or something like that.
Yeah.
There's not these huge, huge pieces. And hear me out on this. Maybe I'm crazy, but this is kind of their second attempt at this. And sorry to go back to Adam Hart's Mother, but that was essentially the same thing, a 20-something minute song with
Yep.
all these different components. They have like the live band and the orchestra, and it just doesn't work. And there's a lot of different elements in Adam Hart Mother, kind of just mishmashed, whereas this just feels very tonally complete. It takes you on a journey. I think the lyrics are some of Pink Floyd's best. I love the lyrics of the song.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think that's just one album different. If you play Adam Hart Mother to Echoes, it's such a massive leap in their sound and maturity and their ability to have a sound.
Yeah. And I was going to say, because we're not going to touch on Adam Hart Mother on this podcast series, I guess for for those at home, it is a 20-minute long orchestral piece that Pink Floyd composed. Obviously, they play on it too, but the big thing there is it's all instrumental. And they composed it because they had to give it to the orchestra. They composed it in like actual chunks. So more what you're saying, where there's like movements and whatnot. Whereas I feel like Echoes, they just took a really good 5-minute song and then kept extending it out. So it feels like the four of them, and it feels like a band piece. And as you say, it has a really coherent feel because of that. And thus, I think it's probably the longest lasting fan favorite from this album, because it just has the coherency and, as I said before, the wonderful dynamics, wonderful lyrics, as you said. So it really is just the best of the best.
I thought of a better analogy for this album. It reminds me of pointillism in art, which is the technique of painting the really small dots that form the larger picture, but no particular dot or color is necessarily drawing attention, right? They all just kind of form the one picture, and you're not necessarily distracted by brush strokes or, color selection. That's probably a better comparison, I think.
I feel like that's a great comparison. And I feel like that is a great way of thinking about it, where I really do feel like nothing particularly has bubbled up over the surface. And it's just a bunch of, as you said, just a bunch of vanilla milkshakes. And I will say, though, that's the magic of Pink Floyd. I think they're for everyone because of that. And it isn't till it gets too Rogery where I think you really start to feel like, ooh, this is a flavor I'm not sure if I like, or wow, I really love. But like that's only when it gets Rogery later, when you're up to eyeballs in the Rog. And I'll spit on my own point by saying that actually I really love that they experimented 4 times and then did Echoes, because I think Dark Side of the Moon is frankly just a perfect album. Like, it's fantastic. So many elements are working, but you can feel that they honed in on something. Whereas I feel like this time they were like, okay, we'll try this, try this, try this. And I actually feel like the first 4 are such different types of songs. And then obviously Echoes is Echoes. I actually really liked hearing that they experimented with actually trying to write some songs before Dark Side of the Moon, and experimented pleasantly.
Are there any other albums that come to people's minds that are kind of like this, where it's almost like 2 distinct sounds that got put on the same album? Just out of curiosity.
I guess 2112. Yeah, and actually, no, maybe that is the answer. So 2112 is an insane rock opera, and then they have 5 just like groovy Rush songs.
Got to fill that vinyl, 'cause the label says so.
Gotta fill it out. So it's interesting that in a previous episode we were talking about the Yes album, because Yes had 2 previous albums that did okay or whatever, and then they deliver the Yes album, which is crazy madness. And I was actually thinking about the record companies in the 70s really had some guts. Because I was thinking the previous Pink Floyd albums did okay, but they were super experimental in so much as Ummagumma is, I think, 2 albums before this. And that was each of the members of Pink Floyd got to have a side to experiment on. So they had 4 vinyl sides.
Ryan is shaking his head.
It's a long haul. And then ditto the one right before this, Adam Hart Mother, is 2 massive songs. And then Rick, Roger, and David all get a song. But again, like, the stomach of the record company is to be like, yeah, we'll just let you do like a giant orchestral 20-minute long thing, and then like, why not? We'll try again the next year. Like, we'll just give you some more money and we can do it again the next year. But I was like, man, to experiment that hard back in the 70s when this physically cost money to make the vinyl.
Tape cost money. Multiple takes cost money. Like,
I also don't know, it must have been expensive to bring the dog into this and like, that you're just in the studio and you're like, oh, what are we doing today? Well, we're going to spend 8 hours getting this dog to bark, and that'll be a day of recording, which we're going to pay for. So the 70s were good, I guess. I don't know. I don't know what my point is with that. And actually, that leads me to my big question. I'm pretty sure I know what all of you are going to say about this. Does Echoes suck the air out of the rest of this album? I never asked this question about Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and then certainly never asked this question about More or Saucerful of Secrets or whatever. I'm just going, 7 weird little psychedelic songs, 10 weird little psychedelic songs. I think this one, it feels like, one of Pink Floyd's like top 3 best songs they ever made. Oh, and then those other songs.
Yeah, I mean, if you just hear Meddle, you just think, oh, the Echoes album. And then you spend, 20 minutes getting to Echoes.
Yeah.
Not that it's not an enjoyable journey, but it's just, oh boy, once you get there, you forget about whatever else you heard because it's so freaking good.
I think it depends on which lens you're looking at or listening to with these songs. If you're listening to this with a progressive lens, I think Echoes absolutely does. But if you're listening to this more, I guess, general speaking, with the exception of Seamus, and actually probably the intro, but, Fearless, Saint-Tropez, A Pillow of Winds, those are all songs that could be played on the radio. And I don't necessarily think that makes them, worse songs. They're definitely not quite as an epic example of prog rock like Echoes is.
Yeah.
But it's just because it's different, I don't think it's overshadowed.
Yeah, it's interesting where, to put my cards on the table, I feel like I vote with my feet in the sense that I never really revisited the rest of this album all that much. Like, obviously, I've listened to this album a lot in my life, but Echoes is the one, and Echoes is, top 5 Pink Floyd songs ever for me. But there's something about Echoes that, for me, I'm just like, I can't wait. I don't want to wait through the other 5. I just have to have my Echoes. Whereas, oddly enough, I'd say Animals is a much more aggressive and hard to listen to album. And yet, I listened to all 3 of the main songs there with glee. And I don't know why. With this, I think the intensity of Echoes, it beckons me. And I want to go on the journey.
Again, Dark Side of the Moon is, I still think it's a 45-minute song.
Yeah.
It's one song. And there's a very, very clear narrative through the whole thing, whereas this is them starting to find that sound, but being way more experimental.
Yep.
They're willing to go on a 23-minute journey, which, to kind of answer your previous question, sucks the air out of it because it was literally neatly packaged on the other side of the album when it was an LP. You could, if all you wanted was to have your dessert and eat that and nothing else, you could do it. And it was just very neatly contained there.
Ready to go.
I actually do listen to the whole thing every time.
Yeah, no, and I was going to say, I've definitely in my life listened to this plenty. Yeah, I'm surprised at how much Echoes just drew me in, and I've remained with Echoes in terms of, it's just one of those amazing songs that I return to time and time again. Then there's 4.5 other songs.
It's like the bacon in a dish. It's the taste me food that overshadows literally everything else. It's pretty good. But the second you mix that with everything else, that's all you taste.
Yep.
It'd be interesting, and not that I can back this up with any evidence, but if you went to different vinyl shops, given that this was the second half of the album, could you just measure how much more of this was played in the other half of this album? I bet you people back in the day, they just let's just start on the second side. We don't need to listen to the first half.
Actually, very interesting point you make. And actually, it's not that ridiculous of a point. So I inherited the Yes album from my dad. I don't think it was actually his album. I don't know who he inherited it from. But on the vinyl, Verm, so the last solo in Starship Trooper, had completely worn out. So someone, whoever had owned this, just kept playing that last 3-minute solo, and it truly had worn that little stretch of vinyl out. So, yeah, no, you ain't crazy.
There's got to be something to it.
There's got to be something to it. I guess my final thought for Meddle the thought I will leave you all with, and then you can comment on it. So I would never have said Meddle is my favorite album of Pink Floyd, but at various points in my Pink Floyd fandom, it has been the album I've listened to the most. So I would say, perhaps, that this is a good enough album in its own right and doesn't just need to be looked at as a sketchpad for Dark Side of the Moon. I would respect that opinion, but I do think Meddle is a fun experiment in its own right. I don't think Dark Side terminally sucks the air out of Meddle. Your thoughts?
This might be their first prog album. You could agree or disagree with me, but I still think, Amagama, everything comes before it though, still has twinges of things that don't match like the theatrical bombast of prog, where that now they're getting there.
And you think they're just on the cusp of unlocking the concept of the concept album?
Exactly, because that's literally the next thing they do.
Yep.
I think that this album was a necessary precursor to their later, more influential albums on music. This is not one that you hear of often. This is not one that I think most people will have listened to, for the most part. However, now having heard it, I'm not convinced they could have made Dark Side of the Moon without doing this first. So in that regard, I think it is extremely important, even though it didn't necessarily have the cultural significance that their later albums did. I think this was a pivotal stepping stone for them as a band to go on and accomplish the things that they did.
Do you think the flavor of this album is different enough from, say, Dark Side, that it's not just simply the blueprints or like the draftsman's sketch?
From a lyrical perspective, I would agree. I think the lyrics are still very... the only word that's coming to mind is like common, but it is relatable and probably less existential and intense than their later lyrics were. And so from a lyrical perspective, yes, I think this is distinctly different.
I don't view this at all as just the Star Wars prequel that no one really wants to watch, that doesn't stand on its own, other than to just lead us into the story we know and love. I think it does stand alone. I mean, even structurally, the album's pretty different. The sound is very different. I think it stands completely on its own.
Yeah.
Ooh, interesting question. I might lean on it does suck the air out. I think it's almost too good. It'd be interesting to ask the band members if they had a time machine, would they go back and do anything differently on this album? Would they try to make it more consistent, more of an obvious transition to that new sound, or they keep the weird little mix? Because I can't unhear this just being the Echoes album.
Yeah.
I think it's so much better than the rest of the album, which doesn't necessarily make the other part bad, other than Seamus. But I'll respectfully be on the other side of the argument on that one.
No, I think that's perfectly fair. I mean, I guess I was just going to say that I think this is an album worthy of listening to, and I think actually because of what you said, this is their final kind of clearinghouse for all the late 60s songs that they just needed to be done with. I think if you enjoyed earlier Floyd, this is the last chance you get to hear it, kind of before their next album, and then Echoes happens, and then we're clearly on the road to Dark Side of the Moon. So there we go. Some have said it's a vanilla album, but vanilla is a flavor too.
It's a great flavor.
So that was Pink Floyd's Meddle. And this has been a sort of young person's guide to prog rock. I have been your host, Ian Prize, and I want to thank my guests, Anne, Brian, and Ryan. Thank you, guys. So, follow us on Instagram at ProgFrogPod. If you have any longer thoughts, queries, or questions, it is helloprogfrog at gmail.com. As always, rate us wherever you're listening to us. So Meddle did fairly well, and Echoes would go on to become a live fan favorite. So Pink Floyd would spend the next year touring and recording the movie soundtrack Obscured by Clouds. But we will catch up with the Floyd again in 1973 with 5 simple words. Dark Side of the Moon. But next week, we rejoin Yes, who had recently fired their organ player, but a caped crusader, an explorer of forbidden sonic pleasures, was waiting in the wings. Join us next week as Yes returns victorious with Rick Wakeman and Fragile. Genuine question, how many of the songs can you sing? Because I can sing all of them.
From Cats?
Yeah.
Oh, that's embarrassing, Ian. I wouldn't have that on the recording.
Don't tell people. Do not tell people that.
No, I'm absolutely cutting this out. It's deeply shameful, but it's funny because it's like, I know it's a god-awful musical, and yet I can sing every single song.